Before he became a ghost in the machine of America's greatest secret, before the Soviets and modern Russians called him a hero, before he rewrote the blueprint of nuclear espionage, Mr. George Koval was just a boy from the Midwest. Born on Christmas Day in 1913 in Sioux City, Iowa, George Koval's arrival into the world was in itself a kind of paradox. A Jewish boy born into a land of Christians, to parents who were not just immigrants, but also revolutionaries in their hearts. His parents, Abel and Ethel Koval, were part of the massive wave of Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution in the Russian Empire at the time. But they weren't just escaping the pogroms of Tsarist Russia, they were running toward an idea that glimmered like firelight in the darkness, and that idea was Marxism. Like many dreamers of the early 20th century, Abel Koval believed that capitalism had failed the working man. He joined a little-known but passionately active group called the Jewish Communist Labor Bund, preaching worker solidarity and social justice. And although they settled in the humble heartland of Iowa, the Kovals never fully let go of their radical ideas. George grew up in a household where Karl Marx's Das Kapital shared shelf space with the Torah, where discussions over dinner were as likely to include the phrase class struggle as pass the potatoes. He was from a young age caught between two worlds, one that told him to pledge allegiance to the flag, and another that whispered of revolution across the ocean in a mysterious land called the Soviet Union. By all outward appearances, George was an exceptional American student. He excelled in science and mathematics. He won local academic competitions, and he was even accepted into college at just 15 years old. Really a prodigy by any standard, right? But beneath that bright young mind, the ideological roots planted by his family were beginning to sprout. And in 1932, during the depths of the Great Depression, when soup lines stretched for blocks and the American dream seemed like a cruel joke, the Kovals made a shocking decision. That year, the entire family packed up their life and moved to the Soviet Union, joining the so-called American Workers' Colony in Moscow, a little-known but very real community of American idealists who believed Stalin's USSR was the future of equality and progress. While thousands of Soviets dreamed of escaping to America, the Kovals did the exact opposite. George was still just a teenager. He renounced his American dream for the promise of something bigger, a worker's paradise built on science, unity, and revolutionary vision. In Moscow, George thrived. He quickly became fluent in Russian and enrolled in the prestigious Mendeleev Institute of Chemistry, the Soviet Union's premier institution for scientific research at the time. Here, surrounded by the best Soviet minds, George developed not only his scientific acumen, but also his loyalty to the Soviet government. He wasn't just a young chemist anymore. He was being shaped quietly into a weapon. But even then, even in his early 20s, George Koval was no ordinary Soviet citizen. He was American by birth, educated in the West, ideologically pure in the eyes of Moscow, and now a rising star in the scientific realm. He was the perfect fusion of two worlds. A child of the capitalist empire, now reborn in the crucible of socialism. To the right recruiter, he wasn't just promising, he was downright irresistible. And someone in the shadows of the Kremlin saw this. He had the name, he had the mind, he had the accent, he had the face of a patriot and the heart of a spy in the making. In the Soviet Union, the line between science and espionage has always been razor thin. And in the turbulent late 1930s, while the West flirted with fascism and war, Stalin's intelligence apparatus was watching, testing, and grooming. The streets of Moscow echoed not just with parades and promises, but with whispers. Whispers of men being recruited not for their muscle, but for their minds. Among these whispers emerged a name. Georgy Abramovich Koval. Bright, trustworthy, and American. To Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, he was the ultimate long con, the ultimate spy, a sleeper agent with perfect credentials, clean paper trails, and a face that no one in the West would question. They saw in him a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, a man who could walk straight into the most secure scientific facilities on Earth and then walk out completely untouched. So, in around 1939 or 1940, Koval was quietly brought into the fold. He began formal training with the GRU, the Soviet Union's elite military intelligence agency. While the more infamous NKVD, later the KGB, operated through fear and surveillance, the GRU specialized in stealth, covert operations, deep cover infiltrations, and scientific theft on a more global scale. Koval's training was intense. He learned how to forge identities, how to build hidden radios, how to communicate in code, and perhaps most importantly, how to appear completely harmless. Because his greatest weapon wasn't just a gun. It was simply a clipboard, a lab coat, and a quiet smile. By the early 1940s, the world was burning. The Nazis had torn through Europe, Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, and America, the United States, was finally at war. And as the United States began pouring billions and billions into a top-secret nuclear program known as the Manhattan Project, the Soviets knew that they had to act fast. They needed eyes and ears on the inside. And who better to send than the smiling, American-born, Moscow-trained chemist? He could pass any background check. His American birth certificate was authentic. His English was flawless. His Midwestern accent unmistakable. His knowledge of science and chemistry was top of the class. In the world of espionage, that wasn't just luck. That was a master stroke. So Koval was given a new life. Under the alias George Green, he returned to the United States in 1940, posing as an unremarkable immigrant seeking a new fresh start. Within a few short years, he had enrolled at Columbia University, and he was surrounded by scientists, engineers, and, well, future weapon researchers. So then, in 1943, the real break came. With the war intensifying, Koval was then officially drafted into the U.S. Army. Not into combat, though, but into the Special Engineer Detachment, a unit made up of scientists and technicians working on America's most sensitive weapons research. Thanks to his background in chemistry and nuclear physics, George Koval was assigned top-secret clearance to one of the most classified operations in human history, the Manhattan Project. He had done it. He wasn't just inside the system. He was quite literally embedded in the very core of it. Not in the periphery, not on the outside looking in, but with access. Real access to weapons-grade materials, isotope separation techniques, trigger designs, and lab-level details that even most generals in the U.S. military couldn't touch themselves. Now, while the world believed it was racing towards victory over fascism, Koval was quietly pacing behind them, one stolen detail at a time. Every report, every calculation, Every seemingly innocuous piece of lab intel was another brick in the wall of the Soviet nuclear dream. And the Americans had no idea. They weren't just letting the fox into the henhouse, they were handing him the keys. The Soviets didn't build their first atomic bomb alone. They had help. Help from a young man who once walked the cornfields of Iowa and now walked the corridors of history. So now our story will lead us to a place called Oak Ridge in Tennessee. It was a city that wasn't on any map. It was a city that was built in complete secret, hidden among the hills of Tennessee. To the outside world, it didn't exist at all. But to the scientists, soldiers, and spies who worked there, it was the very engine of the apocalypse. They called it Oak Ridge. Created in 1942 under the code name Site X, Oak Ridge was a fortress of science, and it was an industrial behemoth built to refine uranium for the world's first atomic bomb. Sprawling across 56,000 acres, powered by hundreds of megawatts of electricity drawn from the nearby TVA dams, it was the single largest secret in American history. Thousands of workers were brought in, engineers, chemists, laborers, and they were only told that, well, what they needed to know, and that was not a lot. Most didn't even understand what they were even helping to build. But George Koval knew, and unlike others, he wasn't there to build the bomb, he was there to steal it. In 1944, George Koval, working under his Army role with the Special Engineer Detachment, was transferred to Oak Ridge. Officially, he was a health physics officer, responsible for radiation safety in uranium processing areas. Unofficially, he was now within arm's reach of the Manhattan Project's most secretive and sensitive secrets. So, at Oak Ridge, Koval gained access to K-25 and Y-12, two of the most advanced nuclear facilities on Earth. Here, uranium-235 was painstakingly separated from its more stable cousin, uranium-238, using a method known as gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation. This process was so classified that workers were forbidden to even say the word uranium aloud. But Koval didn't need to ask questions. He already knew what to look for. Blueprints, technical memos, notes on isotope yields, material handling logs, personnel lists, supply chains. He quietly gathered it all. Memorized, copied, and passed along to Soviet handlers without so much as a whisper of suspicion from the American government. Koval worked with remarkable discipline. He never broke protocol, he never skipped shifts, he was polite, professional, and most dangerously completely forgettable. He was the perfect ghost, visible to everyone and remembered by no one. And because he had military clearance, Koval could have entered restricted zones that most civilians couldn't even dream of entering. Now, he moved between laboratories, reviewed radiation reports, attended technical briefings, basically absorbing any and everything that he could. One of the most valuable pieces of intelligence he uncovered was the scale of uranium production, and more importantly, how close the Americans were to completing the bomb. That information was pure gold for the Soviet Union. It told Stalin not only what America had, but when they'd be able to use it. When the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in August of 1945, the Soviet Union was watching, but they weren't surprised because George Koval himself had already told them that it was coming. After the war ended, George Koval didn't boast, he didn't run, he simply continued his work until he was assigned to an even more critical target in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, Ohio, proudly my home city, was home of Polonium-210, the radioactive key to the plutonium bomb's core. By the time he had left Oak Ridge in Tennessee, George had already done irreparable damage. He had peeled back the layers of America's atomic armor and handed them to Moscow directly, detail by chilling detail. Not with a flash drive, not with a gun, but with a clipboard, a very keen eye, and a memory built for betrayal. We often think of spies as men in trench coats, slipping into alleys under the moonlight, but George Koval was different in every way, shape, and form. He didn't hide in the shadows. He stood beneath fluorescent lights in plain sight and watched the bomb come to life. So let's discuss the secrets of polonium, or the activities that occurred here in Dayton, Ohio in the mid-1940s. My home city of Dayton, Ohio, that is. By 1945, George Koval had already breached one of the most secure facilities in the United States, but the Soviets weren't done with him. There was still one more piece of the puzzle, one final component they needed to trigger the fury of the atom, and without it, there would be no Soviet bomb. And that component was polonium-210. Polonium is a very rare and deadly element. It is 400 times more toxic than cyanide, and it doesn't explode, it starts explosions. Inside the plutonium bomb, like the one dropped on Nagasaki, was a tiny device called an initiator. It was a sphere no bigger than a golf ball, hidden deep into the weapon's core. It was made of beryllium and polonium-210, and its sole purpose was to flood the bomb with a burst of neutrons at the precise moment of implosion. This microscopic spark was the difference between a dud and a mushroom cloud. And just like the uranium refinement in Oak Ridge in Tennessee, America kept this technology deeply compartmentalized. Few even knew where the polonium came from. Fewer still understood what it even did, but George Koval knew both. And in 1945, George Koval was quietly reassigned to Dayton, Ohio, to what we now know as the Dayton Project, which is a subdivision of the Manhattan Project, and the Dayton Project operated in plain sight. Behind its unassuming facade, the facility housed one of the most hazardous and sensitive operations in the entire U.S. nuclear program, the production and assembly of polonium initiators. It was here, among unremarkable Midwestern streets and factory walls, that the core of the Fat Man bomb was born. As before, George Koval was placed in a radiation safety role, perfect cover for accessing lab reports, safety documentation, storage records, and material usage logs. And once again, he vanished into the bureaucracy, quietly mapping the hidden arteries of the atomic bomb. But this time, he wasn't just passing along timelines or theory. He was giving the Soviets exact dimensions, exact assembly methods, exact quantities used, and most critically of all, how polonium was obtained and handled. Now, until George Koval's reports, Soviet scientists had struggled to replicate the precision of American detonators. They didn't fully understand how the chain reaction was initiated. Koval's intelligence solved that mystery almost overnight for the Soviets. With this data that was created by the Americans, Soviet physicist Igor Kurchatov and his team were able to design a polonium-based initiator nearly identical to the American model, the same kind used in RDS-1, the first Soviet nuclear test in 1949. The Americans were left stunned. How had the Soviets closed the gap so quickly? They had expected years and years of delay. Instead, the USSR unveiled a fully functional atomic bomb in just 4 years. And still, no one suspected George Koval of anything. And by now, the war was over. The world had entered the uneasy calm of a Cold War. But for George Koval, his mission was not complete yet, but was nearly complete. He had infiltrated 2 of the most critical nuclear sites in the Western world and passed every test. By 1948, the net was beginning to tighten. Paranoia about spies had begun to ripple throughout Washington. Hints of betrayal, whispers of moles. Other agents like Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs were about to be exposed. Koval saw what was coming for him, and like any good ghost, he disappeared. He left the U.S. Army without fanfare, boarded a freighter, and made his way across the Atlantic. By the time his name ever reached suspicion, he was already back in the Soviet Union. The Americans never caught him, no trial, no headlines, just a silence that echoed louder than any confession. George Koval had done what no one else ever had. He walked into the heart of the Manhattan Project and walked back out with literally a nuclear trigger. Some spies are caught in a flash, arrested at the border, interrogated in dark rooms, remembered, well, in handcuffs. And others vanish so completely, so effortlessly, that by the time you realize they were never really who you thought they were, they're gone. The post-war years were a time of reckoning. America had of course emerged victorious, but also still uneasy. The atomic bomb had given the U.S. a godlike power, and also with that a crippling paranoia. In Washington, whispers grew louder and louder. Who told the secrets to the Soviets? How did they catch up so fast? Eyes turned inward. Suspicions became policy. It was the dawn of the Red Scare in America. By 1949, British physicist Klaus Fuchs, a key Manhattan Project scientist, confessed to passing secrets to the USSR. His arrest led to the capture of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and suddenly the American public saw spies everywhere. The FBI launched one of the largest intelligence sweeps in history. But through all of this, every wiretap, every interrogation, every congressional subpoena, one name never came up, and that name was, of course, George Koval. George Koval had already slipped away, quietly and cleanly. After completing his assignments in Dayton and Oak Ridge, he resigned from the U.S. Army and returned briefly to civilian life in New York. He laid low, he blended in, and then sometime in 1948, using forged documents and vague travel permissions, he boarded a freighter bound for Europe. There were no farewell parties, there were no goodbyes, there were no missing persons reports. He just simply vanished. By the time the FBI even began suspecting a leak at Oak Ridge, George Koval was already at home, back in the Soviet Union, back to the country that had trained him, that had trusted him, and now quietly welcomed him as a hero with no name. But unlike the Rosenbergs or Fuchs, George Koval did not live in fame or luxury. In fact, he lived in near obscurity. He taught chemistry, he translated technical manuals, he lectured at schools under his real name, and for decades he told no one what he had done. Not his students, not his neighbors, not even reportedly his own family. He was a complete ghost, even in the country that he had helped protect. And like all ghosts, his story would remain hidden until long after he was gone. George Koval died in 2006 at the age of 92 in Moscow, Russia. He passed away as he had lived, in silence. No headlines and no ceremonies. But 1 year later, in a move that stunned Western intelligence historians, Russian President Vladimir Putin posthumously awarded him nation's highest honor, Hero of the Russian Federation. In the official citation, Koval was credited with providing the Soviet Union with critical intelligence that significantly accelerated the development of Russia's nuclear weapon. In short, they said he changed the world. Now, Koval didn't steal one bomb. He reshaped the Cold War in and of itself, equalizing the balance of terror and ushering in an era where mutually assured destruction kept the world from fire. He never fired a shot, he never pulled a trigger, But through his silence and his science and his shadow, George Koval may have been the most devastatingly effective spy in American history, and probably in Soviet history as well.